Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to start in just a few moments, but in the meantime, as I pass it over to our presenter, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. As some of you have already seen, there is a question box in your dashboard. You can use that to ask questions throughout the presentation. We're going to hold all of the questions until the end during our Q&A session. Also, since it's often asked, this webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be automatically sent to you shortly after the presentation is over, and then you'll probably get another email shortly after, like maybe a few days after, because we'll cut out some of the beginning, just so that you don't have to have this logistical part at the beginning. Also, just so that everybody is familiar with some of the other tools that you have at your disposal to interact, there's the hand raising function that I see somebody just raised their hand. So you can use that hand raising function to, if we have any like yes or no questions, we'll let you know. I actually have one right now. The question that I want to ask is how many of you have actually put together a scientific poster and figure before? If you have, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'm going to take a look. And it looks like, oh, it looks like a good chunk of everyone has in fact done a scientific poster before. It's about 50%. So I'm going to launch our first poll here while the presenter is getting ready, and ask everyone, how would you describe your past experience with scientific posters? So your options are: my design skills are impeccable, award-winning, I'm a scientist, not an artist, title, text, charts, the science speaks for itself, or I do what I can, but I want to do better. And I'm going to close the poll in just a few moments as these responses come in 3, 2, 1, and then, so here we go. 7% of you have apparently won awards for your design skills. 6% are right up there with Bones from Star Trek, and they are scientists and nothing more. And 87% do what they can, but they want to do better. And the good news is you are in the right place if that is the case, because today's presentation is all about that, balancing design and content in scientific posters and figures. I'm your host, Nathaniel Janik. I work with the American Geophysical Union as the Digital Marketing Content Senior Specialist. And we are joined today by Amisha Gadani, who is a senior artist at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics, and also faculty at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Amisha. And I'm going to also say unmute yourself. It looks like you're muted on your end.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah, that's better. We can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this web seminar. I would love to see your faces, but we're going to do what we can. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about sort of balancing the pros and cons of coming up with a good design, and also remembering that it's really about your content, and so we're always trying to get your content to be really clear. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Just another thing here. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and this is an image that you'll recognize from the poster marketing for this talk, and I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Okay, next slide. Oops, there we go. Okay. All right, so the talk, we're going to have a little bit of an intro to me. That's me sitting in my office just this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about communicating research in terms of illustration, so that'll sort of feed directly from the intro. And then we'll talk about how to communicate research through posters and research papers and other types of presentations that you do. So talking about design principles that I use daily when I work in illustration and how those can be directly applied to your posters. The illustration on this page is an illustration I made for a publication, a science publication called LIMN, L-I-M-N, and the publication was about hacks, leaks, and breaches. And so I wanted to make an image that communicated the sort of paranoia and anxiety that people feel when they are using various websites on the internet. So I made an entire sphere of eyeballs, which is one of the fun things I get to do. Okay, so a little bit about me. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and it's landlocked. I think I would have to drive about 2 to 3 hours to get to the ocean, and I think something about growing up in a landlocked place makes you feel really romantic about the ocean. So I've always been interested in science, but really broadly, my family is a bunch of scientists, but seeing images of the top corner there, which is a bait ball, was one of the hooks that got me to really focus my interest in science in a particular area. Although I didn't pursue science academically, I did take several courses in college that I took along with my traditional art courses that I was taking at Carnegie Mellon. So I started to think about ways in which humans could incorporate different animal defensive behaviors. So I started in the ocean, and I created this large green dress that can inflate like a pufferfish when I'm intimidated. So there's a little image of a pufferfish on the center of this. Actually, I can move my cursor here, and you can see the little pufferfish. And then I started to follow up with that, and I continue to think about other animals, and I've created a dress that has porcupine quills that can erect when I'm intimidated. The dress on the far corner is a skink dress. There's a little organism down here with the blue tail. So it's this lizard that has a tail that is actually a sacrificial limb, and it has these fracture plates in the skeleton. And so the tail can be pulled off right at that juncture between the blue and the brown of this lizard. And so the predator gets a snack, and the prey gets to live and can actually grow another tail, and it's a really fantastic solution. So I also incorporated that into this costume. So in these different defensive dresses, this is part of my art practice, but I was still thinking about ways to pull in a viewer, pull in my audience by creating this sort of shiny, interesting garment, and then having this secret defense that was hidden in that would surprise and provide another layer of information. And that kind of combination of things we'll see again in some of my other work here. I started working at the Exploratorium, which is a science museum. It's a science and art and human perception museum, actually, in San Francisco. And that's just a little bit more background to kind of explain my dual foothold in both the art and creative world, and my continued exploration, investigation of different properties in science, whether it be electronics and or biology or minerals. And then I started to do these dissections, and I got really interested in the internal architecture of the body, and I was making presentations. And so instead of showing the insides of these organs, which is the heart, lungs, and trachea of a sheep, I sort of cut everything down and trimmed all of the different kind of extraneous bits of fleshy tissue off of it, so it looked really presentable. And I also organized the different tissue samples at the top. Those 3 different sections. That's the tissue of the aorta, tissue of one of the veins, and tissue of the trachea. So my efforts to communicate the science topics that I was investigating, whether it be animal defense or internal organ anatomy, is something I've been thinking a lot about, even as it applies to totally different contexts to what you're working on, which is more of a 2D exploration of these research topics, whether it be posters or illustrations. So I just wanted to give you just that little bit of background into the variety of other places that I explore science communication. Okay, so moving on, I've been working at the Institute for Society and Genetics for about 5 or so years in varying contexts. Here are some of the chickens I work with. It's a really interesting motley group of researchers that focus more in the biology side of things and researchers that focus more in anthropology or sociology or archaeology. So this institute is an institute where there are undergrads, and so we have a degree program, but it's sort of still departmental adjacent. It's not quite a department, but it brings together faculty from really different areas that all address a topic from different viewpoints and kind of allows them to have a forum in which to discuss that, and also they teach classes. So in my work for these faculty, my illustrations range from straightforward illustrations, you know, hi Amisha, I'd like you to help me with this paper. I have a graph that's showing the relationship between a family of pufferfishes, and I'd like to have some just pufferfish illustrations of a couple different species to go along with my graph. So sure, so I do those, and sometimes I work with a primatologist, and so I have a bunch of primate work here. One advantage of having illustrations that are interesting is that you are more likely to get pulled in for the cover, which gives your illustration or your research, excuse me, a little bit more of an oomph, more of a push, more of an audience, and so that's nice. Yeah, so a variety of different things, a lot of fishes, a lot of primates. And when I started working more on the interpretation of more complex research topics into single images, so less straightforward type of illustration styles, I started to look at a bunch of Edward Tufte books. So Edward Tufte is alive right now. He's a statistician, and he's been creating a series of books for a long time talking about how to clearly organize information, whether it be on a graph. And so he's got some really strong opinions about box plots. As you can see over here in the side underneath his name, I'm circling with my arrow. I'm not sure how visible that's going to be, but so you can see he feels that there's a lot of extraneous ink, which is one thing that a phrase that he likes to talk about, you know, like making sure that you're being really efficient with your use of marking. And do you need to have a whole box there, or can you just have a dot to represent the center point, which is the 50% of, you know, whatever. Do you really need to have this whole box structure around, or could you just suggest those spaces by having those spaces empty? So he's got, so it's interesting to read. He's got a lot of different books. I would recommend borrowing all of these from the library or going on Amazon and getting a bunch of these. The visual display of quantitative information is really great. That's the one that I reference the most, I think. He does a really nice job of looking at the historical, just the history of graphs and how we've been displaying information, but he also has wonderful sections where he shows a graph that he thinks could be improved, and then he shows how he would improve that graph, and so you can kind of see what his edits would be, and you can decide for yourself if that really is easier to read, or if perhaps it's too minimal. So people have strong opinions about Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte himself has very strong opinions about how to create a really good graph. And either way, I think it's important for everybody who wants to kind of take a little bit deeper approach into the way they construct their graphs to take a look at his work. So I started to think about, sorry about that, I think somebody's, should have closed my Gmail. All right, so I started to be asked to work on larger posters. So the poster that's larger on this excuse me, on this slide is the final poster, and the two beside it are the ones that were drafts that weren't accepted for different reasons. So you can see that there's a connection between, just if you look at the design elements on the larger poster here, there's a connection between the colors of the different arrows here and the colors of the different names of the speakers. I also chose to put the speaker names in large all caps, the last name in all caps, so that their last names are easier to see. Oftentimes we know people mostly by their last name, especially in academia, so I wanted to highlight that. And then there is an image in the background, but it's not an image that is really important for the viewer to really understand. It's sort of a background kind of terrain thing. And honestly, this was a bit of a compromise because the people I was working with really wanted an image in the background. As you can see from some of my drafts, I tried to not have the image in the background, but I think it works pretty well. And just to look at a little bit of the design process, scientists will come to me and they'll talk to me about their research. We'll have a really nice kind of Q&A. I'll ask them all the questions that I have because typically I don't know everything about, the ancient barbarians and population migration from, some part of Europe. So it's really great for them to kind of come up with a nice synthesis, and then I also get to understand a little bit more about their research, which is nice. So I usually, after listening to people talk about their work, I leave with a couple main ideas, and those are the ideas that I want to get across to my audience as my #1 priority. And so you could see that migration, I wanted to communicate migration, and I landed on this idea of arrows. And so the arrows are sort of each color sort of representing a different population, and the arrows are coming together and moving apart and sort of interacting together with each other. So this idea with the arrows, this was the first page over here, moved to putting more content within the arrows. So if each arrow, if the color represents a culture, maybe I could make the shape of the arrow and the color of the arrow together represent a culture. So I started looking at some of the different cultures that the Romans described as barbarians. So they were really a collection of different groups of people. There were the Picts and various other types of cultures there. So I pulled in artifacts that I found when I would research like burial sites of these different groups of people and artifacts, and I used that to build an arrow, and then you can see some of those examples here, and then I experimented with how they would look if they were moving around, and then I also thought, if you look at the smallest image on the page, I was imagining that there might be some question mark arrows to talk about some of the populations that we were still unsure about, their identity. So you can see, and if we move back to the previous one, how those initial conversations led to an idea of the main focus and the main draw that I could use to pull people to this research and pull people to the poster, and then wanting to use an image twice, right? Like wanting to do two things with one image, show that it's an arrow, connote migration, but also show a cultural aspect and through the arrow. So have the arrow show a culture, but also have the arrow connote migration. And that doubling of image usage is another thing that I'll talk about, and I'll show some other examples of. Here are some other posters that I've done. I'm not going to go into the same amount of detail, but I just wanted you to see a little bit of the variety of different work that happens in the department, but also the type of posters I've done. So our chemical nature, when I was talking to that researcher, he was talking about all of the toxic elements that we eat sort of unknowingly. And there's more to the research, but that was what really stuck with me. And I continue thinking about, if I were looking at this poster, what would pull me to the poster? If I was listening to this research, what's the image that I see in my mind, or what would attract me to this poster? And so I thought of, showing a face, showing a whole person eating, but really it's just about that moment before the food that is toxic enters the mouth. And so I just focused in on the mouth, and then added a little environment with different types of trees and a little bird and a couple smokestacks, so that you can, because those communicate toxicity, right? So I'm also trying to use some visuals that communicate the information naturally, right? Okay, and so then with the center image, I wanted to talk about the different genders. This is a good example where the easiest way to communicate gender is to use pink and blue. But of course, for various reasons, you might not want to use pink and blue. Maybe you disagree with the binary and the breakdown and the cultural acceptance of these two colors as representing the genders, but you know that is the fastest way, if you like it or not, it's the fastest way to communicate male and female. And so I actually did put some pink and blue elements in this, but I created this pattern in the background that is a really tight sort of pattern. And again, the pattern, I'm using it to communicate the culture of these groups of genders. And this talk was really about people that don't directly identify with one gender or the other. So there's this sort of Venn diagram when both genders overlap. What do you get in the center? And that's where I put all the information for the talk, right? So what do you get in the center when you combine the genders together? Well, we'll talk about that during Intersects Beyond the Binary. And then there was the embodiment and unequal environments talk. The idea that I kept getting from their research and talking with the scientists was that it was this sort of never-ending partnership and never-ending collection of problems that involved all of these different entities, everything from like the medical field to the sugar soda industry, from blood vessels to churches. So there were so many different elements involved that, and the problems seemed to persist over large spans of time. So I ended up imagining that I ended up focusing on two ideas there: that it was happening forever, so I created this sort of helix, this sort of infinity symbol, this Mobius, and that it was involving many different elements. So I wanted to communicate the specific elements that were being discussed in the research, and then I also wanted to communicate that eternal aspect of these problems. My illustration work can get even more abstract, where I am asked to help researchers who are, for example, in this case, thinking about the relationship between social movements and the internet, and how the internet has provided this wide network of communication that really fosters the bursting of little movements that have no central organization, but that have presences in many different countries, many different cities. Excuse me. So, in specific, she was researching the Occupy movement and noticing how that movement was put together. And so you had organizations of people that supported this movement in many different cities, and they would operate independently, but still operate within the same framework, the same goals, and the same methods. So she asked me to create an image that was influenced by the rhizome structure. So this idea of an underground network of roots that mushrooms will pop up in various different places, but the root structure is really what's connecting the mushrooms together, even though they might be popping up in really different spaces. And then she again asked me to reference a lot of different types of images. You know, she wanted to talk about how the internet is connecting different continents through undersea cables, but also terrestrial cables. One interesting thing about the undersea cables is that they are being attacked by sharks. I don't know if you knew that. So I have this shark that's hiding in plain sight in the middle there, munching on some undersea cables. And that, you know, there's a history of communication devices that's on the corner over here by where my arrow is pointing. And then a couple other physical references that she wanted to illustrate. And so here are the sentences that I pulled out that were the ones that were important to me as she was talking. So I would kind of take notes while the researchers were talking to me, and then I used those key sentences to direct the shape of my illustration. And so going back, you can see that there is this this network. Everything is connected. I was allowed to add a little bit of a whimsical element in actual mushrooms popping up in a couple of places here and there, which I really liked. And then you can see there's an Occupy sign that's a little bit pretty specific. There's some coral and other sorts of undersea plants and animals growing off of that pipe. There are cafes and houses, and these are all places that people access the internet from. And then, you know, there's some more of my notes. And so there's LA City Hall because she wanted to be a little bit specific to LA. All right, so that's the illustration called Hypercommons. And then just one last, I think this is one of the last ones here. So I wanted to create a set of illustrations for a researcher who is studying the transgenic effects of chemicals in the environment on organisms that live there. And so his lab studies BPA pretty frequently, and so and he uses C. elegans, that worm, as his model organism. And so he asked me to come up with a way to show multiple generations. And I was actually fortunate enough to find a researcher that had thought of this, a similar idea of using Matryoshka dolls, but I really wanted to, and I thought that was a nice way, right? Because one fits within the other. Oftentimes, if you're showing multiple generations, you could show, you know, 5 different abstract men, the kind of men that you might see on a bathroom sign, or women on a bathroom sign, but they might look like sisters or children, or all in the same age. You know, it's hard to communicate generation differences that way. So I think the Matryoshka doll works out well, and so I agreed with that other researcher. But I wanted to incorporate more of his specific research into the design of the doll. And so I put in the chemical signatures of some of the chemicals that he researches. The BPA is, I believe, the one that's directly flanking the face of these different Matryoshka dolls. And then I incorporated the worm shape into the central design that overlaps each other to form a helix to reference the epigenetic and genetic aspect of the research the scientist is doing. And then if you notice, the faces get a little bit unhappier as they get smaller. So that's referencing the results that he's found, which is, yes, the chemicals that your great-great-grandmother was exposed to can affect the your own affect your own health 4 generations later or more. So, and here are some of the designs that I was thinking of beforehand. So you can see I was imagining this sort of nesting style. I was thinking about what the orientation of the dolls would be in. Here's a reference image of those worms that I was mentioning, the C. elegans, and I referenced obviously Matryoshka designs. And the image at the top corner of the cloud of with a couple chemical symbols in it, with the Matryoshka doll sort of opening up into the cloud, is actually an alternate design that he has used in presentation. So this was an illustration for a presentation. The Hypercommons illustration, that was also for a presentation. So sometimes I'm working to create an illustration for published articles or articles to be published. Sometimes I'm making illustrations to describe sort of general research that they can then use as illustrations on their websites or on in presentations that they give. So there's a variety of different contexts in which my illustrations will feed, but they're always trying to communicate the research of the researchers I work with. And that feeds into my own art practice a little bit. So oftentimes your day job will filter into your art practice. In my case, I've been making much more 2D illustrations since working on those more sculptural garments that you saw before. I've been really interested in the evolution of animal signaling color. And if you see at the bottom there, the baboons, for example, their bottoms will be redder as they, move into maturity, and that's a sort of a signal that they are ready to mate. And then same with the red-footed boobies. And then some animals have a red head that stays red, that isn't actually changing for seasonally, but it's still interesting that the rest of the body is dull colored, but they have these really bright elements. And so I pulled those together into what I'm calling color chimeras. And so you can see some examples there. I've also been thinking about the research that my coworkers do, and some of them have been creating 3D models of hypothetical boxfishes. And so I've been taking it upon myself to create sort of paleontological-like reconstructions of the skin of these hypothetical boxfishes. And I've also been interested in the birds without beaks at the top corner there. I've been interested in comparing the diversity of shapes of the interface between bird feather and beak, and sort of the identity of a bird. Once you take the beak away, they kind of end up looking like these strange, fluffy mammals. Anyway, so I've been exploring a little bit of science illustration style work in my own art practice. All right, so moving on from data to your poster. When you're working on a science poster, or if you're working on a research paper, you're always trying to take all of the, like weeks and weeks you spent in your lab and all the data you collected and try to tell everybody about what you found, right? So you've got your data, and in this case, you're trying to make a poster. And so when you put your poster together, you're going to be hanging your poster up in a, really large auditoriums. Usually you can see that there are upwards of 250 posters that you can see here, and you can already see that in the world of poster design there are a couple of similarities and a couple of conventions people tend to follow, right? You can see that the predominant color in the poster design tends to be, in this picture anyway, tends to be sort of a navy blue, and even if the navy blue isn't the dominant color, there definitely seems to be a convention of putting a bold color behind the title text. Sometimes that's orange, looks like sometimes that's green. Most of the time it's still navy blue. So you can already see that maybe there are some, there's an opportunity to explore a couple other colors maybe. But I just want you to kind of remember the context of the poster when you're putting it together, and then also be slightly aware of the conventions that are there, and maybe question some of those conventions. And so as we move, this is actually, Nathaniel was saying that this is actually one of the conventions that he's been to, and maybe some of you in the audience have been to this convention. This is just another sample photo that I found that shows the context of a poster session. So as you move in a little bit closer, there's a little bit more detail that you can see. There's some more comparisons that you can make between these posters. They tend to be broken up into these clearly outlined blocks. Right, so you can see these rectangles sort of fit together like Tetris shapes within the the framework. Again, you can see that bold rectangle at the top. There should be, on most of these, there should be some research, graphs and figures, and those are, some of them are larger and some of them are smaller. So there's sort of a range of size of graphs, and some of the posters are employing a background color. All right. So moving on, this is I just wanted to kind of zoom into the poster experience. So this is just the last slide showing that one-on-one interaction that happens right after the poster. And I also wanted to point this out because oftentimes what happens if you are at a poster session is that people will sort of stop looking at your poster after a certain amount of time, and then they'll just look at you, and then you will point to the figure at different parts, but then all of the rest of the information you sort of just tell them, right? But you're not always going to be beside your poster. Okay, and here's just another view on the ground floor. All right, so when you're putting your poster together, it's important to ask yourself what your goals are, right? So obviously you want to get your information across, right? You really want it to be readable, and this is, maybe obvious as well, but I think that there are times when we expect a lot from our viewers, we expect a lot from our audience, like, oh, well, if you squint, if you get really close, then you can read it, or if you really want to read it, then you'll read it. Maybe just have the information that you want people to read on your poster, and maybe try to make it all readable. Includes graphs. So I talked to a lot of the faculty in the department when I was putting this presentation together. I also talked to my siblings, and my sister is a professor at Emory, and she feels very strongly about the inclusion of graphs, and specifically graphs that have labeled axes. So she wanted me to point that out. So includes graphs and considers your audience, right? So kind of when we were zooming in, you could see that, you're going to have big swaths of people that are coming past your poster. You know this, I've seen it. And you want to remember the context of your poster session. So maybe you're in a poster session that's a conference that's really pretty broad, right? Maybe your conference is really, really specific, but even if you're, say you're an ichthyologist and you're studying evolutionary biology, and you're at a conference that's all about fishes, people at that conference, they might all be people that work with fishes, but they might not work with the specific type of fish you work with, right? So it still might be beneficial to show some illustrations of the fishes you work with, just to give a little bit more context to the people that are coming there, because these are not your average viewers, but they're still not people that work in your lab, right, or on your specific organism. And so consider your audience, and then maybe ask yourself, who is your audience, right? Just again, like I was saying, think about the type of conferences you're at, and how broad those conferences are. And even if they're really specific, it's nice to have a reminder of like a reminder visual of the main element of your research. That's in my opinion. All right, so the other thing I want you to consider is what you do when you look at a poster, right? Often when we make a poster, or we make an illustration, or we make an art piece, right, we have expectations like, oh, well, somebody's going to come over to my art piece, and they're gonna look at it, and they're going to be really interested in it, and then they're going to get closer, and then they're going to see that the tortoise is representing the slow movement of I don't know, of science outside of America. I don't know, right? So we have expectations, and sometimes they're very grand expectations when we're building our own poster. But when we look at other posters, we might look at them for just a few seconds and make some type of judgment call, be disinterested, and move on, right? So what is it that you look for first when you see a poster? What do you look for second, right? Is the first thing the title? Is the second thing the graph? Do you ever read, or how much do you read the introduction? How likely are you to read the summary if it's not in bullet points, right? What are you looking for when you view a poster? And this might be something that you just think about and consider, and maybe take a couple notes the next time you're at a poster session, like, oh, okay, well, I really liked that, and maybe I should consider putting that into my poster. All right, so let's look at a couple different examples. These are examples of posters that I found just from searches on Google. I don't know the people whose posters these are, so I just wanted to speak with a little bit of respect about their poster design. I'm not here to be overly critical. At the end of the day, poster design is still a fairly subjective enterprise, and so these are just some of improvements and tweaks that I would make to make the varying posters that I'm going to be showing you a little bit easier to read and maybe more informative. So in this example, I think the first thing that I would do is consider whether I really wanted that picture in the background. Pictures in the background typically have a negative effect on the readability of your content, right? So yes, it's faded, right? So I can see the text, but it's still not super easy to read. And maybe that photo, maybe it could be somewhere else, right? Like, I like that it gives me a sense of the environment that this research was selected from, and these organisms came from. I like that it gives me that, but maybe it could be just reduced so that the mountains were only in the border there behind part of the title. But then I also like that the title is on a solid background so that I can really easily read the title. So maybe it could be reduced and put in a different part of the poster, right? So if you really want to have an image in the background, I would ask yourself if it's really important for you to have it there. And if it's not super important, consider that it's still affecting how easy it is for someone to read your text, even if you dull it down, and that it might be a better idea or an alternate idea to move it to a different location. And then in this one, so I'm just going to say a couple things about each one. In this one, in this poster, again, I don't know the people, and I think, the information is coming across, but I would be careful to be too cute, as my dad would say, right? To have design elements for no other reason than to just have something different, right? Make sure that all of your choices are helping convey your information, right? If this research had something to do with a diagonal path that molecules tend to follow, maybe, or if this research had any type of relevance to having a diagonal, that might make me more inclined to consider this as a cool option. But otherwise, I think it's not really enhancing the clarity of the content. And so I might try to find another way to make my poster stand out. I would also, and this might just be a personal thing, I feel like the fade background could be maybe applied more intentionally here. I'm not a huge fan of fades, but that's, again, like, this is one of those places that that gets very subjective. But if you are doing a fade, maybe consider why you want one area to be darker. Maybe it's really helpful for one side of your poster to be darker because it helps to show the type of graph you have, or it works better with your image. So if you are putting in a graph, try to integrate it a little bit more and make it a little bit more intentional. In this next chart, what I like about it is that they have these illustrations at the very top that are showing exactly what this what the series of start positions are for speed skaters, right? So I don't know the context of this poster. I don't know if this poster was presented at an event that was about researching athletics and ethics. So I don't really know who the people in the audience are, but I do really appreciate that that this person went to the went to the effort to find this illustration or hire someone to make it because it's a main part of their argument, right? So they're talking about, so it's main part of their argument, which you can see if you read the titles. Life is unfair and so is speed skating. Some athletes can randomly benefit from alerting effects due to inconsistent starting procedures. So I think that's a good choice for illustration. It pulls people in because it looks a little bit different, and it also conveys a strong element that is pretty central to the research. The other thing I like about this poster is that the graphs are pretty large, and I think it's a good idea to try to make your graphs as large as you can. And I understand that sometimes you have a lot of graphs and you want to get them all in, so sometimes that's not possible. But if wherever possible, try to make your graphs as large as you can, because a lot of times that's what people are going to either first or second when they look at your poster. And so then we're at this poster, which is the last example I'll show you before we go to an example I have where I do a quick redesign. So in this poster, Egyptian goose and the mute swan, distribution and natural history of large invasive waterfowl in Texas. What I like about it is that they're using color to define the different categories. And I think that's a pretty smart way to avoid having to create big rectangles of either outlines or rectangle color sections underneath black text, but actually define the sections by having color text that's still dark enough to read, so the text is still readable, but you can see clear, distinct differences between each category. And also, if you look at the colors, when you start creating graphs that have lots of different color elements, it can get a bit unnerving, I know, and a bit worrisome. So in this case, the colors were chosen either by going on, the colors were chosen, and then there's different sections were colored by pulling colors out of those pie charts. So there are a couple different places you can go if you have trouble finding like 5 distinct colors or 3 distinct colors. So if you go online, there are various resources. I can, during the Q&A section, if there's someone that's interested, I can go on the web and pull up a couple to show you. But there are places that are out there to help you come up with color categories and color patterns and color palettes, so that you can feel a little bit more confident about the colors you choose. So I like that it was constructed like that. It also doesn't look quite like a science poster, and that's because after a little bit of reading about this particular poster, this poster was actually created by a designer for a scientist. So you can see what happens. So the designer didn't know what the conventions were necessarily of a science poster, was still had the goal of conveying the information that the researcher wanted to convey. But when you question the convention a little bit, you might find that as a result, your poster can explore a couple other different formats and structures that might be more beneficial to conveying your information. So this is the poster that I spent a little bit more time reviewing. So the poster is called "Will Manatees Still Exist in 2100? Effects of Cold Winters and Watercraft Accidents." So there's pretty nice like format that you've seen before, right? Like this is a pretty conventional science poster. You've got enumerated subject headings. The far right section is the discussion. The far left section is the introduction. The center is the results, and this is all pretty standard stuff. Right, okay. So the first thing that I would look at is the image. So for me anyway, that's the first thing that I would look at. So I'm looking at the image, and it's not a fantastic illustration of a manatee, right? After looking at this poster a little bit longer, I realized that that might have been an intentional choice to have a black and white kind of copy artifact manatee because they wanted to connote extinction. And I think that it does do that. Once that I understood it was connoting an extinction, I did feel that the image was working better, but it was still not intentional enough, because I was able to think that it was just a poorly selected image for most of the time that I looked at this poster. I had to actually really think a little bit before I understood, oh, maybe it's connoting extinction. So if you do really want to play with that idea of sort of the look of a manatee on the side of a milk carton, maybe play that up a little bit more. Maybe be a little bit more confident, and maybe find a milk carton and stick this image on the side using something like Adobe Photoshop. Or this could be a great opportunity to hire somebody to make an illustration for you of a milk carton and a manatee. So I would say if you want to do something, make sure that if you want to do something interesting like that with your image, make sure it looks intentional, and make sure if people are misunderstanding your image, it doesn't look quickly, it's not a negative, it doesn't look like a negative thing, right? Because when I first saw this, it looked like just a poorly selected image, right? Okay, so the other thing that I looked at is the title, obviously. So, will manatees still exist? The effects of cold winters and watercraft accidents. So I looked over the information a little bit because it's a little bit blurry, but I was still able to read most of it. And it looks like they're saying that if the boat and if the watercraft accidents increase, then it looks like the manatees are likely to not exist, right? So it looks like their extinction possibility increases with the number of watercraft accidents. And you can see if you look at the section of text right below the manatee, and actually, let me get my highlighter out. Okay, I can do the arrow. So if you look right here and here, actually, you can see a section where they really address the extinction risk. And that seemed like the most salient part of their paper. And one of the faculty that I worked with has been working with his students to have them always explain the results in the title of the science poster. And so I made a quick redesign of this poster using Adobe Illustrator. So let's move to the next slide. I think I have to go back to my pen, excuse me. Okay. All right, so I made a quick redesign here. Okay. I don't know why the pink pointer is still on. Sorry about the pink pointer. Okay, so just ignore that pink arrow. All of the content I just simplified to lorem ipsum for right now, but I changed the title to Manatees at Risk of Extinction if Boat Collision Deaths Increase. So I like the title that they had before. I like the title, Will Manatees Still Exist? It's got a little bit of punch in it, but it doesn't have the, it just said the effects of cold winter watercrafts, right? I would rather see the result, right? Like, what are the effects of cold winters and watercraft accidents, right? Oftentimes you have an open-ended part of your title because you want to lure people into your research poster, right? But I would say that this is one of those examples where you might be just asking too much, right? If you want people to come to your research paper, just tell them what the results that you found, and then they'll come because they want to know how you got to those results, right? So will manatees still exist in 2100? Manatees at risk of extinction if boat collision deaths increase. Maybe you could combine those two things together. So the first thing I did when I made my quick redesign is take the background back to white. I'm a fan of a sort of a minimal approach to poster design and just design in general. I don't mind the blue necessarily. I just felt that it wasn't really working in a super fantastic way, and having a white background gives me the opportunity to try out changing the color of some of the text, which is something that I wanted to try given how much I liked the poster that we saw a minute ago about the goose and the swans. In this case, I liked the idea of having color text more than having a colored background. And then you can see there's a set of graphs at the bottom corner, which I just left. So the gray sections are their graphs. And I left all of the graph material, the graph sections in the same place. I really just changed the font, made it a little bit of a cleaner font. This is Helvetica. In terms of fonts, again, there's a lot of opinion about fonts, and there's a lot of opinion about the best fonts and the right fonts. I tend to keep it pretty simple and stay either with Helvetica or my little brother, he's also a scientist and he swears by Arial. I like the non-serif aspect. It feels a little bit more modern, it feels a little bit more clean. Then again, there are times when I do like serif. So when I'm communicating a lot of content like this, I think I would generally recommend a sans serif font. But again, this is one of those things that is a bit subjective. So you can also see, so I made the font, I made the background white. I changed the font to Helvetica. I introduced a color to the text. I also took out the numbers that are beside introduction and objectives and methods. I didn't think the numbers were really helpful. You know, you can sort of understand the general progression of the research practice. That is who your audience is, right? So this is taking advantage of the fact that your audience knows that your introduction and your objectives and your methods and your results will all come before your discussion section. And it's also, you're reading, typically in America, we read left to right. And so we would start at the introduction section already when we were reading this paper. So you wouldn't need to, again, have the numbers there. So I took out the number because it was feeling a little bit superfluous, excuse me. The other thing that I did was break down the paragraph a little bit. So you can see in introduction, the paragraph text starts right after introduction. That was just to try to allow the possibility of increasing the font size and still keeping the same amount of information. In this case, I don't really want to address the content. Coming up with the right content to describe is something that you'll have to do with your own research and with your own lab and maybe with your own coworkers and research people. I'm not going to really address what's the best type of, the best information to put out in this case. As you can see, in my own practice with illustrations, I do think a lot about how much information to convey and the content, but in this case, that is up to the presenter. So the other thing that I did was you can see that I also removed the bullet points. This is something that I would actually have kept if this is something that I would actually recommend keeping. And so although I took out the bullet points, if I were to make an edit to my own re-edit here, I would add back in the bullet points. I talked to some more faculty since putting this quick redesign together, and it seems like the bullet points are a really great way to direct the viewer's eye, right? So when an audience member comes to your poster, they're gonna look at the bullet points and that'll be just easier to read than a paragraph format text. So I would pull back in the bullet points here. And then if you move on to the next slide.
Hey, Amisha, I'm actually going to jump in here because we only have 4 minutes left. So I was just going to suggest that we just hop to Q&A right now.
Oh, no.
I have a number of questions. And definitely folks are interested in looking at your suggestions for color palettes. And color patterns. So if you want to pull that up while I sort of take a look at some of these other questions and answer what I can.
I'm so sorry that I went over, everyone.
Oh, it's okay. Right.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't even get to my fun slides. Can I just go through a few fun slides?
You just, go power
really
through this.
Okay, so just to summarize, it's a balance game. You've got your text, you've got your image, you've got your content, you've got flair. Don't put superfluous flair. You want to inform, but you also want to delight and attract people. We know that the top sentence is really hard to read. It's still hard to read with red text. It's still better. It's a little bit better with the white text, but still not that great. And just consider how important it is for your poster to have an image in the background. Try putting colored text instead of having lines down. Think about your image really carefully, and thanks very much.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so a lot of people wrote in some questions. If you have more questions, feel free to throw them out there, everyone in the audience.
Okay.
We have some recommendations here. I'm going to let you pull up your suggestions for the color palettes while I answer some of these.
Okay.
Somebody suggested colorbrewer.org
Yeah.
for a place to get color palettes.
Yeah.
Another person, while you're looking, asked for suggestions on using colors that are more accessible to those that are colorblind. If you have some good suggestions for that. I know that you
That's an
already
option on the
mentioned.
color palette, on these color palette websites. I think that's an
Yeah.
option.
Okay. Oh
So,
yeah.
for example, here's one of them. You can decide you want a monochromatic. This is one color. Maybe you want to have adjacent colors. So, oftentimes in color theory, you can get it more into that later. People look for colors that are close to each other. Or maybe you want colors that are really far from each other. Say you have a graph and you're trying to communicate 3 different things. You want it to be really distinct. You could try looking at this, and then they're showing you 3 sets of colors that are really far away from each other on this color wheel. You could even
Yeah.
do 4. So this is one place that I would try going to.
And that's Peloton.com. And for everybody in the audience, because I know this is going quickly, I have everybody's email, so I'll be sending stuff out at the end of the email, like probably later today, early tomorrow. I'll send some responses to people's questions.
Yeah, I apologize, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking with it. I'm sorry if I talked fast, or sorry that I went over.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so it sounded like you already answered. Illustrator is what you typically use. Do you have any other suggestions that aren't Creative Cloud subscription based?
Unfortunately, I do most of my work with the Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Creative Cloud. I don't know. There are subscriptions to Adobe Creative Cloud that are only Illustrator or only Photoshop. So maybe there are ways for you to not get the entire suite. It's a powerful, fantastic program. And I know that, departments vary in their funding, but maybe you could put an argument together about getting it. There are other options for non-Adobe Creative Cloud programs. I just don't know them off the top of my head, so I apologize about that.
Oh, yeah, no problem. All right, well, we did hit the 3 o'clock mark, so I want to thank everybody that hung around, and I see more people are adding in their own suggestions. So I'm going to collect what everybody else suggested, and I'll disseminate it to the rest of the crowd after the webinar is over. Thank you so much for putting this presentation on, Amisha.
Oh, thanks very much.
Yeah, and for everybody in the audience, I hope that I will see all of you at fall meeting this year in Washington, D.C. in December, and hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar. Thanks again to everyone who attended. Thank you, Amisha.
All right, thanks, Nathaniel. Bye.
Bye.